أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وآل محمد. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم والقول الحق والأصدق القائلين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ونفس وما سواها فجورها وتقواها قد أفلح من زكاها وقد خاب من دساها. And before we begin, really quickly, if I could ask you, today's the 40th day after the passing of my friend Arush's brother, Mahmoud Nadeem Rahman. I could ask you all to just read one Surah Al-Fatiha for its soul and grant and make a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant him paradise next to Muhammad and to grant his family patience. So with that, I can ask you all to Islam to recite one Surah Al-Fatiha. Again, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant Brother Nadeem Rahman al-Marhum paradise in the company of the Prophet and his family, and to give patience to my friend Arush and her family during this difficult time. For today's discussion, inshallah, I want to continue our conversation from last week, where we began to define the human soul, or what is known as the nafs, as God states within the Holy Qur'an, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. Last week we talked about the two main opinions in terms of how we define the human soul. The first definition is that the soul is one's essential nature, whereby we speak to the human being. We speak of the I, the me, the you beyond the you, the me beyond the me, the internal nature of the human being that goes beyond our physical form. That we are a physical as well as we are a spiritual, and that though our physical bodies, they die, they decay, they enter into the grave, it's the soul of the human being which continues to remain. The second opinion is that the soul is a combination of one's feelings. It's a metaphysical reality whereby all of the human beings' feelings, be they anger, be they depression, be they happiness, be they joy, so on and so forth, all of these feelings are comprised within this metaphysical reality known as a nafs, known as the soul. And we define sort of what the soul is, how it could potentially be an enemy of the human being. As the Prophet ﷺ states, "A'da aduwak an-nafsullati bayna jambayk," that surely your greatest enemy is that soul which rests between your two shoulders. Today, inshallah, I want to talk about how the soul can be of detriment to the human being. First of all, like we talked about last week again, that the human being, we often go through different states during the course of our lives. We go through certain states whereby we feel more compelled or more attracted toward virtue, toward beauty, toward that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls to. But at other times, we don't feel so inspired, nor do we feel so motivated to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that when we see ourselves in that state, whereby we don't have that motivation nor that inspiration to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's important that we check ourselves. It's important that we check our souls in order to see if we have a diagnosis that is distancing us, or a barrier that is distancing us from our Creator. And so the soul often goes through numerous different sort of symptoms, so to say. Symptom number one is that we often convince ourselves that we are perfect, in the same way that we convince ourselves when it comes to the physical dimension that we don't have any ailments. Let me sort of put this in perspective for you for just a moment. Oftentimes, when we take a look at our own behaviors, be it our diet, be it our exercise, on the physical lens, we take a look internally and we say, you know what, I'm going to eat this cookie, or I'm going to eat this donut, or I'm going to eat this cake. Because at the end of the day, it's not going to affect me the same way that it affects my father, or my mother, or my cousin, or so on and so forth. Oftentimes to the detriment, because we fail to, in reality, check our physical states, or we ignore. People don't like to go to the doctor because they're afraid if they're going to get a negative prognosis. In reality, you should probably go and see the doctor because there may be ailments that we don't see physical to the eye. And you being knowledgeable about your ailment can actually have more potential to rectify it as opposed to allowing for it to get worse. On the spiritual lens, we often do the same, whereby we convince ourselves that we're doing okay, that spiritually we're okay, that we have a perfectly fine relationship with God, mentally we're totally fine, we don't have any issues, and that this in and of itself is problematic. Because we never want to take the necessary steps to improve during the course of our spiritual journeys. And that's exactly what it is. So to sit back and to contemplate and to reflect and to take a look internally within ourselves, to find those spiritual diseases that are creating ailment for us. Be it anger, be it pride, be it lust, be it desire for wealth, for power, for whatever. Any of these. And all of them are certain diseases that our souls can be inflicted by. But amongst those first symptoms that we have to keep in check is to making sure that we do not see ourselves as beyond fault, as beyond error, but rather always to hold ourselves to account. حاسبوا أنفسكم قبل أن تحاسبوا. As the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ states, hold yourselves to account before you're held to account, meaning by God. But check in to see how you're doing. And make sure that you're critical, not for the sake that you beat yourself up, but for the sake that you grow. Similarly, we should do the same with our physical bodies. Right? This is number one. The first symptom of disease is that we convince ourselves of it. The second one is that we virtually fool ourselves or justify to ourselves that everything that we're doing is okay. For instance, we may rely too much on the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, God is going to be merciful to me anyway. He's going to forgive me anyway. So it's okay for me to eat this. It's okay for me to do this because God's all merciful. He's all compassionate. What difference does it make? Again, we are a human being who often justifies our behaviors. I'll give you an example. After the Battle of Karbala, Kufans, they went to Umar ibn Sa'd, who was the general of the army of Yazid ibn Muawiyah in Karbala, Umar ibn Sa'd. And they tell him, they say, oh, Ibn Sa'd, why did you kill Hussein? He says, no, it wasn't me. I didn't kill Hussein. Shimr killed Hussein. They go to Shimr, who was the actual individual who committed the deed. And they say, why did you kill Hussein? He said, no, it wasn't me. It was under the order of Umar ibn Sa'd. Putting off responsibility. They go again to Umar ibn Sa'd. They said, he says that you're the one who killed him. He says, no, I did it under the order of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, who was the governor of Kufa. They would go to Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. They say, why did you kill Hussein? He said, no, it wasn't me. I did it under the order of Yazid. They go and ask Yazid, why did you kill Hussein? He said, no, you should go and ask Shimr. He's the one who did it. We love to put off responsibility. And then we seek toward justifying why we didn't do anything wrong. This is, of course, sort of a more extreme example. But in our day-to-day lives, we may slip, we may fall, we may transgress, we may sin, whatever it is. But often, even if it's not a sin, something that takes us away from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that in of itself is a problem. Especially if we justify our behaviors, and demonstrate to ourselves at the very least why these things are okay. That's a problem. And that in itself, of course, is very dangerous. Like second symptom, if we see ourselves in that state whereby virtually we fool ourselves into telling us that what we're doing is okay, when in reality it's not, that's a number three. I touched base on this really briefly with number two, but number three is reliance or too much reliance on the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone say, what's wrong with that? It's important. God is Arhamar Rahimi, no doubt. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful of those who show us. But when we over-rely on the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or by extension, the intercession of the Prophet and his family, alayhi salam, and say they're going to intercede for us, that itself is very problematic and very, very dangerous. In fact, in the famous dua of Ali Zayn al-Abidin, he states, Ilahi ad'uka rahiban, raghiban, raji'an, kha'ifa. He states, oh Allah, I supplicate to you, and I'm in between states of hope and desire and want from you, but also I'm fearful. When we seek from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need to be in a state whereby we're relying on God's mercy, but also remembering His punishment. Ilahi idha he continues. Ilahi idha ra'aytu dhunubi fathir. Wa idha ra'aytu karamaka tab. He states, oh Allah, he says, when I take a look at your punishment, I get really frightened. I'm scared. When I take a look at your grace and I remember your compassion, I get greedy. I forget about punishment. I forget about being held to account. So being in the middle and finding a balance in terms of how we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is super important in terms of cultivating and developing and perfecting and purifying ourselves. Because if we are in a state of over-reliance on the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or on the rewards for certain rituals or practices that we engage in, and at the end of the day, there's going to be enough for us to slack on virtually later on. It's like you go to class, you study really hard in the beginning of the semester, then you tail off toward the end because you feel like you've done everything. A lot of times before people graduate, high school especially, maybe not so much in college, trying to get jobs and so on still, but in high school, you get senioritis, so to say. You're no more interested in going to class. You're no more interested in studying. You're no more interested in working hard. But then all of a sudden, there's potential for it to lead to some serious detriment for you in the long term. That in itself is dangerous when it comes to our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything, it's important that as we grow and as the years pass, again, you're that much more focused in caring for these qualities. And number four, so number one, that we convince ourselves that we're perfect. Number two, that we justify our behaviors. Number three is an over-reliance on God's mercy and compassion. Number four, by following our own opinions. By following our own opinions when it comes to matters of theology, when it comes to matters of law, assuming that everyone else is wrong and that we are right, to the extent that we even oppose the statements and the teachings of the Prophet and his family, of the whole Qur'an, that in itself is dangerous. Someone, for instance, might say, what's the purpose of these prayers anyway? That's for a long time ago. We don't need to fast anymore. I'll just intermittently fast. That's healthier for me anyway, for instance, for lack of a better example. Why do we need to go for Hajj? Why do we need to go for Hajj? Because, I don't like the leaders of that regime anyway. Or they justify with whatever way that you like. It's more spiritual for me to go on a hike, to go to the mountain. That might be fine, but these are also obligations from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to be careful in this regard. So far, so good. So again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then He states, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. He states, successful are those who purify these. these hearts. Unsuccessful are those who fail to allow for them to become corrupt. Today, inshallah, I want to focus on 3 steps that we can utilize to purify these souls. Then every week, moving forward, inshallah, we'll focus on one particular aspect of the soul, dive into it in more detail, and wrap up thereafter, after several weeks of speaking with some elements. This is just the sort of introduction last week and this week. So what are some ways then that we can think about, or that we can start to purify or cultivate these souls of ours? As God states again within the Qur'an, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, the successful ones, the victorious ones are those who have purified it. The first step out of 3, we talk about symptoms, which are 4. The first step out of 3, at least for the sake of our discussion, number 1, is to make sure that we are consistently aware. We are aware of our surroundings. And by extent, to understand that we are always in danger. We are always in a state of danger. What does it mean? You know, when you're driving down the highway, you're driving on the street, whatever. When you're driving, if you lose focus for 1 second, it could be to the detriment of yourself, to the passengers in your car, and all of those around you, those pedestrians who are walking, and the other cars that are on the road. Which is why it's so important to always remain as focused as possible during the course of your operating a motor vehicle. That does sound like your insurance company. Similarly, when you take a look at your heart, when you take a look at your soul, losing focus for 1 moment not only is detrimental to yourself and everyone around you, but could be detrimental for generations upon generations. Your one action, your one word, your one comment, your one behavior. We talk about Imam Hussein, we talk about Ashura, we talk about a personality by the name of Qur al-Riyahi. This particular man is in the army of Umar bin Sa'd, standing against the grandson of the Messenger of God. And he utters his famous line, he says, Inni ara nafsi bayna al-jannati wal-nar. He said, surely I see my soul between hell and heaven. I can choose one of these 2 sides. Initially in the army of Umar bin Sa'd, comes and supports Imam Hussein. This man made a decision on that day to stick with his morals, to stick with value, to stick with beauty, to be on the side of God, to be on the side of virtue. And it's very easy for him to have chosen the majority. Very easy for him to have chosen numbers. Very easy for him to justify his behavior, saying, I'm just one member of this massive army, and God will understand that I was virtually compelled and forced into this. Every single one of our decisions, every single one of our interactions, every single one have an influence and an impact in terms of molding and cultivating yourself. Everything. Who we decide to socialize with, who we decide to spend time with, what we decide to talk about, where we decide to go. Everything is placing or imprinting on our souls in a unique way. And we have to understand. We have to understand and how careful it is to be vigilant over our own souls. Which is why when I go back and I said that step number 1 is to be careful, to be aware, I want you to always see yourself again, taking a look at your life through this lens of fragility, as if you're driving on the highway and there's so many people around you. And again, if you lose focus for 1 moment, you can lose a lot. It said that one day there was this guy, he goes to Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid was one of the Abbasid caliphates, one of the Abbasid caliphs. He was known for his wealth, for his power, for his kingdom, whatever. And he goes up to him and he says, "Oh Bahlul," oh Harun. Apparently, the guy who said it was Bahlul. Allahu Alam. He goes to Harun al-Rashid, the king, the caliph, and he tells him, "Oh Harun, let me ask you a question." He says, if you were stranded in the middle of a desert and you were dying of thirst, and I had a cup of water, would you trade me half of your kingdom for my cup of water? Imagine, you own the whole world and you're dying of thirst. Naturally, you take that cup of water so you can survive, right? Obvious. He says, of course I would. That's such a dumb question. Because I'll have the other half of my kingdom. He says, now let me ask you another question. He says, ask me. He says, if I gave you that cup of water, you survived, but you were unable to excrete that water from your body, you're unable to urinate. Excuse the crude example. He says, would you trade the other half of your kingdom so you're able to use the restroom? Some people, it's painful for them. They're so ill, they need a device to remove their excrement from their bodies. He says, yes, I would, of course, because my life is more important than my kingdom. Which he tells him, he says, oh Harun, remember that your life is worth nothing more than a cup of water and using the bathroom. That's it. What's this life? If that in itself has more value in that dire state that you're in than your entire kingdom, then why are you so arrogant? Why are you so prideful? Why do you think that this world is going to last forever? It's not. So be aware. Be vigilant is step number one. And if we are consistently aware and we're consistently careful with our interactions, understanding again that everything around us is imprinting upon our hearts and souls, then inshallah. Number two, step number two, in order to cultivate these souls, in order to purify these souls, is to increase in our knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by reflection. Increase in our knowledge of God by contemplation and reflection. Alhamdulillah alladhi la yablughu midhatahu al-qailun wa la yuhsi na'ma'ahu al-'addun wa la yu'addi haqqahu al-mujtahidun. As Ali alayhi salam, he famously states in his famous sermon, which is narrated, sermon number 1 in Nahj al-Balagha, he states, all praises are due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who not even the eloquence can speak to his praise. Not even the most eloquent can speak to his praise. وَلَا يُحْسِي نَعْمَاءَهُ الْأَدُّونَ. And there is no way to calculate his blessings. وَلَا يُؤَدِّي حَقَّهُ الْمُجْتَهِدُونَ. And no matter how much you strive, you still can't understand his greatness and glory. And what I say, that to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by reflection, to remember that everything around us is a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The sun, the moon, the stars, the oceans, the rivers. And through reflecting upon, you just turn around and see like how much it's raining outside. It's raining really hard. And that in itself demonstrates to us our need to humble ourselves in front of God, because you can see his power and his might all around us. And when we know our station in the eyes of Allah Azza wa Jal, again, there's opportunity for us to know ourselves and thus know him. Man arafa nafsa faqad arafa rabbah. As the report that's attributed to the Prophet ﷺ states, the one who knows his or herself knows God. Through our lowliness, through our dependence on him, we're able to understand his independence from us. Isn't it? And the third step is to perform a'mal. Now, step number one is to understand that we need to be in a state of caution and aware of our surroundings. The second step is to increase our knowledge of God by means of contemplation and reflection. And number three, by means of action. What does this mean? When we say action, we mean literally to perform the deeds that have been prescribed for us that feed these souls. Again, when you want to cater to your body, you exercise and you eat healthy. When you cater to your soul, you perform the deeds and the actions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to perform, and that His Prophet and his family, peace and blessings be upon him, have advised for us to perform, because again, it fills our hearts and souls in a unique way. Through the recitation of the Qur'an, through prayers, through fasting, when we do things with a sense of intentionality, it feeds these souls. One of our past scholars, Ayatollah al-Burajurdi, one day he got angry at one of the students for asking like a question, where he kept on asking this particular question, and he got angry in the class and he scolded him, telling him, "Who do you think you are talking to me and arguing with me about this particular matter?" He says he realized what he had done, getting angry. That was his spiritual disease, so to say, that he needed to work on. So al-Burajurdi, he retires back to his home and he commits to fasting for 1 year. For this one moment of anger in his elderly age, because he says that I can never get angry again like this. This is his punishment virtually to himself. This is his cultivating of the soul for himself that he has given to himself. And he said that he probably told himself that if I get angry at any of my students or at anyone, I will fast for 1 year. Which is his way of putting his soul through work, so to say. Like someone says, if I eat this donut, I have to run 1 mile tomorrow, or run one more mile than I did yesterday, or whatever it might be. So for 1 year, he fasts. No, imagine you fast for 1 day, or you fast for 1 month during the month of Ramadan, how exhausting that is. But he put himself through this. Because again, put yourself or hold yourself to account before you're held to account. It's someone who takes their religion seriously. Someone who takes their responsibility and understands the temporary nature of this world seriously. So again, by means of action. What are some of these actions? Again, prayers, again, fasting, again, recitation of the Qur'an. We talked last week about remembering our mortality or death as in the graveyard. In addition to, it could be something as simple as, again, going out and looking up at the sky and really contemplating and reflecting. Or supplicating and making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By means of the performance of these rituals, there's an opportunity for us, again, to feed these hearts and souls of ours in a meaningful way. So in summary, I'll conclude, can have a little discussion, inshallah, next week in more detail. It's important that we are consistently in a state of checking our symptoms, those that we mentioned. Don't jump toward the assumption that we ourselves are absolved from any difficulty, from any hardship, or any sort of detriment to our soul. There's always room to improve in other ways. And on the flip side, amongst those ways, in order to care, to cultivate, to purify these souls, we'll talk about these things obviously in a lot more extensiveness and detail over the next several weeks. Number one is to always remember to be in a state of awareness. Number two, to increase our knowledge of God by means of reflection. And number three, by means of ritualistic acts of worship as prescribed to us by the Prophet and his family, alayhi salam, which again feed these hearts and feed these souls and cultivate them. Inshallah. Alhamdulillah. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه